Hello and welcome to the Dailyaus. I'm Harry.
I'm Zara.
You may have never heard of Lachlan Murdoch. He's the son of Rupert Murdoch, an Australian-born media mogul who is arguably one of the most powerful men in the world. Rupert wants Lachlan to be the successor in control of his vast global media empire and is currently fighting to make that happen in a US court. In today's deep dive, we'll take a look at the real-life succession drama playing out in America and how much do we really know about Lachlan Murdoch, the man in line to inherit the biggest media empire in the world.
Now, Harry, if we could pay the incredible royalties that were required to play the Succession theme song, I would do it. I'd put my own money up.
I'm just imagining the tune now. It's happening up here, maybe not out here. But
I'm so sorry for anyone that had to listen to that this morning. Anyway, all that to say that we are talking about a real-life succession scenario playing out, and you don't have to have seen the television show to understand this story. But if people haven't been following or haven't been reading about the Murdochs, and, you know, we are in media, we do have a bias towards caring about these sorts of stories, how would you introduce someone like Rupert Murdoch at a party, for example?
Well, first of all, I'd say this is my mate Rupert. He's 93 years old, he was born in Australia, and he is the most influential media mogul in the world. He owns more than 100 news titles, including dozens based in Australia, in the UK, and in the US. And it's very likely you've watched some of them, so think Fox News or Sky News here in Australia, or you've seen some of his news outlets, so the Daily Telegraph, The Australian, or news.com.au online. So it's very likely that you've come across one of his news platforms before.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about the Australian media market, for example, and, you know, us trying to build the dailyaus, so often conversations around media concentration emerge because Rupert Murdoch and News Corp now own so much of the Australian media market. Almost every newspaper, every radio station, every TV station, at some point, whether or not it is now, has been touched by Rupert Murdoch. Why are we speaking about him today, though? Why are we talking about the Murdochs?
So as we've discussed, Rupert owns a massive media empire, and Forbes estimates he's worth about $20 billion US, which is about 30 billion in Australian dollars. And as we know, he's also not a young man anymore. So a lot of attention has turned to what will happen once he passes. And so that's where we go back to 1999, where Rupert divorced his second wife, Anna Murdoch, who he had 3 children with, Elizabeth, Lachlan and James. And by that point, Rupert had one other child, Prudence, who he had from his first marriage, and he set up what's known as an irrevocable trust to split ownership of his businesses, his shares and his money between his 4 children when he divorced Anna. So that's back in the 90s. And now the family's in court debating this trust.
Okay, and for anyone unfamiliar, which I am, what is an irrevocable trust?
It's basically a legal document setting out how Rupert Murdoch's going to divide up his assets after he dies.
Okay.
Irrevocable means it can't be changed, but it has changed before. That's with the exception when Rupert had 2 other children, Chloe and Grace. They were added to this trust, but they aren't involved in this pointy aspect of the trust that is being debated in court. So that's how we end up in Nevada, the great US state next to California, because Rupert is trying to change the trust again. It specifies that Prudence, Elizabeth, Lachlan and James, his first 4 children, each have equal say over the future of Rupert's vast business empire.
Okay, so let me just stop you there just to recap where we're at. So Rupert Murdoch, I mean, he's been married many times, but at this point had been married twice, had 4 children from 2 wives. And so in 1999, after he divorces Anna, his second wife, he sets up this trust. And the premise of the trust is that all of his great fortunes will be passed down to all of his children and that it can't be changed. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay.
Zara, you're coming along the journey with me. And it is a very complicated way of handing down your assets and fortunes. But we're talking about the Murdochs here.
Yeah.
They own...
Very unusual situation.
Absolutely. And so Rupert now wants to change this trust.
The unchangeable trust.
The unchangeable trust. He's going to try and change it because he's Rupert Murdoch. So here's what he wants to do. Rupert wants to change the trust, the unchangeable trust, so that Lachlan is in control of his business fortunes after he dies.
Okay, and so that's changing it from it being all four of them to just being Lachlan. Is that right?
That's right. And
why?
Well, Lachlan is the only one of those four children who's still working for Rupert Murdoch, for one of his businesses, I should say, because he's at a senior position at Fox Corp and News Corp, and there are some other theories as to why. One of them is that he doesn't want internal conflicts within the family affecting the course of the business of his businesses once he dies. So he doesn't want any family divisions to hurt the fortunes of Fox Corp, of News Corp. But it's also widely reported that Lachlan and Rupert are a bit more ideologically aligned, politically aligned these days as well. Lachlan attended his dad's last wedding and the other kids didn't. So it's a bit of rumour mill, a bit of speculation, but that is some of the reasons being put forward why this trust might be changing. And so the other three kids aren't too happy about it at all.
Makes sense.
When you've got your fingertips potentially on a vast media empire, I think you wouldn't want it to slip away from you. And so that's why they're currently in court. They're trying to guarantee that they'll still have some control over the businesses once Rupert dies. And I think it's just important to note here that we wouldn't even really know about what's going on in this Nevada court if it wasn't for the enterprising journalists at the New York Times and their team, because they were the ones that managed to get their hands on this sealed court document, because otherwise it's all happening behind closed doors. We don't really know what's happening in that courtroom.
Okay, so Rupert Murdoch is really fighting for Lachlan to be his successor. And, you know, this isn't just a normal family story. And, you know, you and I were speaking about this off mic. This is about the future of not just Australian media, like the world's media and the way we get our information and who wins elections and who loses elections. And to understand the gravity of it, I really feel like the world needs to understand a bit more about Lachlan Murdoch, because he is this notoriously quite private figure, isn't he?
We don't actually know a huge amount about him. We rely on sources that are close to him, acquaintances that are talking out and friends, but we don't hear much from Lachlan Murdoch himself.
I didn't even know that he had an American accent. I'd only ever read about it. Yeah, I'd only ever read about him, and I had never listened to an interview with him. I've never met him. And so when I was watching the ABC's Australian Story, I was so shocked by how deep his American accent is, and it just made me realise how little I actually do know about him.
And some of those interviews were from when he was a bit younger as well. And I think as he's gotten older, he's been a bit more reluctant to do interviews. I think a lot of the family don't tend to do those sit-down interviews very often. And so I think, to understand who Lachlan Murdoch is, got to go back to his roots. So he was born in London. He's the eldest boy in the family. He lived in Australia in his 20s and he was working in quite senior posts across his dad's businesses. And that's where he met his wife, Zara, who we might know from Australia's Next Top Model.
Correct.
So
lives deep in my brain.
That finale. So Lachlan didn't have a very smooth run in his early years, and it was partly because of rugby league in Australia. So the big rival media family in Australia are the Packers. They had the TV rights to broadcast rugby league. And how did Rupert and Lachlan want to overcome that? Because they also wanted the rights. They set up their own competition. So there were two competitions that occurred in 1996, 1997, and it only really lasted a short amount of time. It was really expensive, and there was a really bitter fallout from it. And Lachlan was also involved in the great rise and collapse of a telecommunications company called OneTel, which fell apart in 2001. But it was a big thing in the late 90s, and that was put down to poor corporate management. But he is credited with investing in Real Estate Australia in the early 2000s. So this is when the internet was first coming to life and developing into what we know the internet to be today. This was like a digital real estate advertising company. It was quite a novel idea at the time, but it's absolutely skyrocketed in value since. So the investment's very much paid off for Lachlan. And it's also now owned by News Corp. Lachlan actually left the family business in 2005 and he went off on his own and he set up an investment firm and lived in Sydney for quite some years.
So the early part of Lachlan Murdoch's career had many kind of inflection points. Interestingly, it overlapped quite a bit with James Packer, who, as you said, is the son of another media mogul. But it really was defined by Lachlan Murdoch emerging from his father's shadow and trying to get out there and propel the business forward.
That's right.
You said he left the company in 2005. What brought him back to it?
Well, he came back in 2014, I think at a time where the Murdochs were in a bit of strife. So his brother James was overseeing the UK arm of the Murdoch media business. It was called News International at the time. It's now News UK. And that's when the whole News of the World scandal broke out. For anyone who's unfamiliar with that, that's when the News of the World, an old tabloid newspaper, was found to be hacking the phones of certain celebrities and then also some victims of crime. So there was a really, really horrific case involving a girl who had disappeared and who later it was found had been murdered. The journalists had managed to hack into her phone. And so it was a massive story. The Murdochs actually had to front a parliamentary inquiry in the UK, and that was really pinned on James. And so that's when we get Lachlan coming back into the fold because Rupert was looking at the job that James was doing. Things were sort of not going too well. And then Lachlan makes a great return and the two brothers become co-chairs of the entertainment behemoth 21st Century Fox. So they co-chaired the company until 2019 before it was sold to Disney. And so this is where things get a bit interesting and the brothers really diverge in their paths because Lachlan had a really significant rise through the ranks of the Murdoch family business through Fox. And it culminated last year when Rupert announced that he was stepping down as the chair of the main two companies, so that's Fox Corp and News Corp, and that he'd be replaced by Lachlan. But what happened to James, you might ask? He stepped away from the family business in 2020 and he cited some issues that he was having. He didn't go into the details of why. But since then, he's made a pretty startling move for Murdoch, which was he criticised the media coverage of the 2020 US election. Now, he didn't specifically speak about his dad or Lachlan. He didn't name them, but he did say that the media was responsible for platforming some views spread by former President Donald Trump after he lost to Joe Biden, saying that the election was rigged, that there had been voter fraud. And so James was very critical of the way that the media had handled those allegations. Fox News actually ended up having to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to settle defamation claims after allowing some of Trump's supporters to spread false claims of election interference and fraud. And James's criticism really didn't go down too well. He reportedly was iced out by the rest of the family after that.
And I think this goes to why it's so fascinating because we are talking about really competing ideologies here. You know, on the one hand, we have James Murdoch, who has criticised the way that platforms like Fox News dealt with the 2020 election result. And on the other hand, we have Lachlan, who we know mirrors, if not sits to the right of his father. And so with this succession plan, we have the kind of possible future direction and political leaning and ideological leaning that comes with it. So can you go into a bit of that? Like, why is it so important to be talking about this?
Well, you touched on some of the reasons why there, but I think it is important to note that when we talk about the Murdochs, sometimes the news and the news industry more broadly gets a little bit obsessed with itself and speaks a bit inwardly.
Yeah.
But we've got to remember, news is how we make sense of the world and what's going on around us. And when you have a family that controls such a vast portion of the news media industry, then they are going to shape how millions of people, are making sense of life around them. And so that's why I think the influence of the Murdochs can't really be overstated. There's a hugely consequential election happening later this year in the US. I don't have to tell you that, Zara, because we've spoken about it a few times.
I've done 900 podcasts on it.
Exactly. But it is so important how that's going to play out, the outcome of that election, what happens afterwards. We saw what happened on January 6th after the 2020 election loss for Donald Trump. So the news and the media have such a huge role to play in that space. And so whoever becomes the new Rupert Murdoch, effectively, is going to have such a vast control and decision-making power that we probably could never quite imagine for ourselves. So when we think about who Lachlan Murdoch is and how powerful he could become, it's just so interesting to think that we actually really don't know that much about him because, as I mentioned, he doesn't do many interviews. He doesn't really like to put his face out there as much. And other than being papped outside the courtroom in Nevada, we really just haven't seen much of Lachlan Murdoch out in public at all.
Yeah. Harry, I want to end with a question for you. We have spoken at length in this podcast about how important Rupert Murdoch is and by extension how important his children are. Do you think that their influence is waning at all as we see this decentralisation of media across the world?
Thanks to a little thing called social media, I would say that legacy news definitely doesn't quite have the power and reach that it once did. But news organisations are on these platforms as well. And they do have the capacity to shape the narrative, so to speak. And they also have a responsibility to tell the truth and to find the truth. And that sounds very lofty, but it's a really important part of democracy. It's a really important part of society. And behind those courtroom doors in Nevada where there's no media because they can't have any access to what's going on, the fate of the biggest news and media business in the English-speaking world is hanging in the balance.
Harry will certainly be keeping a close eye on this one. Thank you for explaining and breaking down all the family politics and broader politics when it comes to this story. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Daily Oz. We would love to hear from you. If you had any thoughts about this story, who do you think should be the successor to Rupert Murdoch? You can leave a comment on Spotify. There's a little question box, and we look forward to reading your answers. We'll be back again tomorrow, but until then, have a great day.